Hi, I'm David Kane, a partner in Baringa's Energy and Resources team, working with large-scale commodity trading clients, typically focused on their response to the energy transition.
My name is Hugh Green. I'm a director in Baringa's Natural Resources department. I work with large commodity producers and traders, typically on their energy transition strategy and with a particular focus on emissions measurement and reduction.
So Hugh, we're seeing a lot of movement at the moment in the market, in the commodities, natural resources space around energy transition. Really interested to know what you see is driving that.
I think what it really is I think a lot of our clients are starting to see that there's a lot of emerging risk and opportunity around this. You know, it's moving away from being that sort of peripheral issue dealt with by a sustainability team who are, producing numbers for the annual report, and really moving into the sort of core of the business in terms of how they operate and how they think about emissions and the implications of that for their business. Interesting.
So what types of risks and opportunities are we starting to see?
I think it varies depending on where you are in the value chain. I think, across the piece, there's some common ones. I think you particularly see increasing regulation everywhere. Mm-hmm. Especially certainly at the production end, there's already quite a bit of regulation and emerging sort of taxation and so on around things like Scope 1 emissions. But increasingly it's starting to come into play around Scope 2 and Scope 3 as well. And then when you start getting into those kind of indirect emissions, that sort of impacts everybody up and down the value chain. You start to see it with traders as well. A lot of traders' emissions are Scope 3. So you probably see it yourself. I mean, you work with a lot of the traders. Do you see them starting to pay attention to this in a different way yourself?
Yeah, I think it's something that's been bubbling up the agenda in the boardroom within the trading businesses, across trading houses, oil and gas majors who trade, metals and mining players who trade, and they are starting to pay attention now to the emissions associated with their business, whereas a couple of years ago it was just kind of further down the priority list. We are seeing that a lot of that is coming from the financing banks that they work with. So the banks are demanding more data and more information around their emissions and wanting to see more around a credible transition plan as to how they reduce the emissions associated with their business. And that's presenting them with a lot of challenges. I don't know if you're seeing the same in the metals and mining world.
Yeah, and I mean, when I look at sort of you mentioned sort of the big integrated producer traders in the oil and gas space, but also in the metal space, we see that, as a lot of our clients now, some of our clients in that space, are working with us on some of these topics. And I think, you mentioned there the financial side. So we've kind of got the regulation, we've got the pressure from the financial community to be more transparent, and that affects cost of capital. And then I think, increasingly they're starting to see opportunity as well. So, you have some of the producers maybe want to be able to put a footprint on some of their products, and certainly some of the minor refiners are looking to do that. They're saying, look, we think we might have a lower intensity product here to market. And in some markets, particularly for things like battery raw materials, that's increasingly important. They're getting a lot of questions from customers about that. So they see an opportunity there to differentiate. But to do that, that's a step change in how you actually measure your emissions. The kind of high-level top-down estimates, that doesn't really work anymore. You've got to go, look at your cradle to gate and really go quite granular. You really need to understand the emissions in your value chain. And that's, I think, a big shift for them as well. I mean, I think you see it's a little bit different for traders, though, because obviously they're not producing.
Yeah, I think with traders being traders are looking to monetize this as well. Mm-hmm. So they are looking at the emissions associated with their business, partly because of the drive from their investors and from their banks. But they're also looking at this as an opportunity as to whether they can market things with a green premium. Not seeing that in the market just yet, but I think it will emerge. But they're also looking at new business lines. You see a lot of the traditional oil trading players who are looking towards power and gas. And that means a whole new raft of ways of working, bringing in new people, new systems, and risk management tools. But we're also seeing people look at the carbon markets, which are becoming more liquid, which are emerging, and we're seeing people move into that space in quite a sizable way. Because they see the opportunity that's emerging in that space.
Yeah, and I think that's the kind of parallel. There's producers trying to differentiate their product on the basis of the fact that they maybe have, they're using more renewables in their refining processes, stuff like that. So they naturally have a lower footprint, and they're engineering out some of the carbon in their in their processes to improve that. And they want to monetize that, they want to recover the cost of doing that and get the benefit. But I think, what we see the traders doing is starting to go, okay, so we're not necessarily in control of the footprint of the product, but we can offer services around this to sort of decarbonize that trade. And that's where they get into, the carbon markets, be it particularly the voluntary carbon markets, to look and offset this. And we do see that, right? We do see some kind of, you see some offset around particular trades.
Yeah, we've seen some green cargoes in the market, some LNG cargoes, some crude cargoes. We've seen some of the green metals products come through in the trading perspective as well. But they've tended to be one-offs to date. And sometimes there's not complete transparency over the calculation of the emissions associated with those. I think what we are seeing in terms of the journey for these businesses is moving towards a much more transparent and traceable view, because they need the data upstream and downstream of those particular trades so that they can understand the end-to-end, and then really share that with their counterparties, their banks and everyone else to look at whether they can in future market things as being low carbon commodities.
Yeah, I think that kind of hits the nail on the head there. You actually need to understand the emissions in the value chain associated with the product you're trading, but also the transport and all the other sources of emissions around that trade before you can offset them, right? So you kind of need the ability to put a footprint on an invoice, right, before you can credibly offset that. And that's the key thing. And I think one of the reasons that we don't see too many of those trades right now, or people are doing them just to demonstrate, I think, to the market that they can generate a little bit of publicity, but they're not offering it routinely, is right now they're still just getting to grips with that traceability and that transparency, and they can't always do that.